Hey everyone, and welcome to this lecture on the Reformation. So we've just finished exploring medieval theology and the developments during the Middle Ages. We talked about Anselm and the ontological argument. We talked about the satisfaction theory of the atonement. Spent a lot of time looking at Thomas Aquinas and how Aquinas becomes, his theological perspective becomes the foundation for the Western Roman Catholic Church. And now we want to talk about the shift that takes place with the Reformation. Now, it is really important for us to think about some of the cultural and philosophical shifts that are happening at this time. So we've been focusing on the conditions of our belief. What are the philosophical tools that help us make sense of the world? And when you think about the pre-modern and the ancient, the patristic, and the medieval, you have kind of this oscillation between Plato and Aristotle. All of it leads to the Ptolemaic understanding of the universe, which sees the earth at the center, humanity at the center, and then these kind of equal circles kind of going around. Everything is nicely ordered. And theologically speaking, this Ptolemaic universe made a lot of sense, and it supported Christian belief. What ends up happening, though, with Galileo and Copernicus, which we'll talk about in a different lecture focused on Kierkegaard, is that vision of the cosmos gets upset. And so you move from a very ordered vision of the cosmos that kind of connects with a biblical and theological perspective to one that is not very neatly ordered. Another way of thinking about it is that you move from an inherently meaningful cosmos where you can talk about things like purpose and design and telos to a cosmos that doesn't seem to have meaning. It's not ordered in the same way. And so it is important to recognize how the philosophical shifts that move from Aristotle through Descartes, and Descartes is trying to make sense in his philosophy of this shift. Like, how now do we kind of make sense of the universe? Where do we find meaning? And again, we'll talk about that in the Kierkegaard lecture. But you move from an inherently meaningful cosmos to one that is seemingly with less meaning. And the philosophical shifts move from Plato and Aristotle through Descartes into Kant and Hegel and so on and so forth. And so this cultural and philosophical shift plays a very important role in the Reformation. One of the things that we'll see is Luther is primarily, one of the things he's primarily opposed to is the Aristotelian philosophy being used to undergird transubstantiation, for example. And so his attack on purgatory and the indulgences and then eventually the authority of the papacy, he writes this thing called the Babylonian captivity of the church, where he has in his sights that Aristotelian kind of framework. So as we think about the context, it's important to think about medieval Catholicism and some of the things that are going on. So we talked about scholasticism and the rise of doctrine and some of the theological development, which Luther is also going to kind of put in his crosshairs, and he's going to challenge some of the scholastic ways of thinking about Scripture and theology. But also the development of the sacramental system, the penitential system, the idea of transubstantiation. And it's also important for us to think about how in Western Roman Catholicism they understand salvation and the relationship between justification and sanctification. And so when you think about justification, what you're thinking about is the saving act. We're justified. It's, if you think about kind of a courtroom, the judge finds someone not guilty, then they're justified. And sanctification is this idea of growing in grace and the Spirit and becoming more holy is one way to think about it. And what is the relationship between these two? Now, in medieval Catholicism, there was an emphasis upon inherited sin and total depravity, and we can't save ourselves. But through the sacramental system, there can become a renewal. And so one way to think about this is that in the sacramental system of the Western Roman Catholic Church, we participated in justification and sanctification by keeping ourselves in the new community, by maintaining our new humanity post-baptism. Baptism washes us clean and it transforms us and now gives us the ability to be able to act morally and act in our own sense of righteousness. And what we'll find is Luther is going to challenge this very understanding and this very system. So another context to this is the moral corruption that begins to happen with the priests and the monastic life. And this is other people besides just Luther are talking about this. We'll see Erasmus here in a little bit. Most people recognize that there is a need for reform in the church. And this includes also the political corruption of the papacy. And then we'll talk about the sale of indulgences. And indulgences are a part of the purgatory system. If you think back to the idea of treasury of merits that we talked about, there's this sense that we can tap into the grace of Christ through acts of charity and so on. And part of that is indulgences, like giving money to the church, like giving alms to the poor is where it would come from in kind of a biblical and maybe even kind of Judaic perspective. And so indulgences were sold as a way for people to use their resources to benefit the church. In the same way today, we take an offering and we give to the church and it's our tithe and so on. And so one of the things we'll have to talk about is how Luther is not necessarily opposed to indulgences. He's opposed initially to what he sees as the corruption of indulgences with Tetzel, and so we'll talk about that. So as we think about the context for Luther, it's important to think about some of the impulses of reform that are already happening. One way to think about this is that Luther is kind of the match that lights the whole thing on fire. And things are coming together for Luther. But before Luther, there were people who were already raising some of these issues and questions. So John Wycliffe from England, a priest from 1329 to 1384, he begins to translate the Bible into English, into the vernacular. If you've heard of the Wycliffe Bible translators, that takes his name. So what he's doing is he's challenging the idea that all of this stuff should be in Latin, for example, and is saying, okay, let's give the Bible into the hands of people in the vernacular language so that they can read it. And he also then began to challenge the authority of tradition. He questioned the transubstantiation. He questioned the authority of the papacy. Now, he's off in England, so he ends up not being kind of killed. So he's on the periphery here of the empire. But his ideas are kind of the ground, so the ground out of which Luther is going to come. And just to show you that some of these ideas are already kind of beginning to take form in different parts of the Western world. John Huss is another one who, like Wycliffe, he challenges the authority of the papacy and the Pope and the tradition, and he's actually killed. He's burned at the stake in 1415. In fact, what's interesting about Huss is Luther gets into a conversation or a debate, and he's asked point blank, "Are you a Hussite?" And so John Huss was declared to be a heretic and was burned at the stake. And Luther, kind of the hothead that he was, basically responded, "I'm a Hussite." And so it ratchets up everything by identifying with someone who's declared a heretic and burned at the stake. You have other groups, the Waldensians and the Bohemian Brethren. We won't get into them. And you begin to get the Brethren of the Common Life, this emphasis on study, meditation, and manual labor, and ministry instead of solitude. So I share that last one with you to show that eventually the whole monastic system is going to be called into question. This idea that you go off and you're really doing the Lord's work, if you're in the priesthood or if you're a monk, there's going to be a push back into the common life of the people through like manual labor and ministry. And eventually for John Calvin, Calvin is going to argue that instead of living this kind of monastic life, we should bring the monastery back into the life of the people. And so each house, each family becomes its own monastery. Now, interestingly, there was also someone in the Catholic Church who was pushing for reform. Erasmus was at the same time as Luther. He was a humanist. So one of the things for us to recognize is some of the changes that are happening culturally here. So the Renaissance is happening. There's a rebirth of learning. All of these, there's a rediscovery of some of these ancient texts and resources. And humanism was really trying to go back into the ancient world and mine it for some of the documents and ideas that they found to be helpful as a part of kind of Western civilization. And so he wants to, as a part of this movement, to return to the Greco-Roman sources. He is calling for a reform of the institutions and the offices and kind of the morality of things. He believes that there needs to be reform put in place. He also emphasizes asceticism. He believes that they need to clean up this kind of Christian living and believes that priests and monks should be living more Christ-like lives. He also emphasizes what is called the philosophy of Christ. All truth is God's truth. So you find in Erasmus somebody who's willing to read some of the pagan authors of the ancient world, Plato and others, to kind of better understand the learning that and the ideas that we can take from them. He remained Catholic, though, and that is the crucial part. And so this is the impulse of reform that is coming from within the Catholic Church. And so he's critical of the church, and he is seeking to bring about reform of the church, if possible. Now, what about Martin Luther? So Martin Luther is an Augustinian monk. So he is influenced by the theology of Augustine. And, you know, he has this thing where he goes to Rome and he sees the corruption of the church and has some serious questions about what's going on. But Luther was somebody who also felt this kind of deep anxiety about his faith and his salvation. And so, again, if you think about this idea that in the Western Catholic world, it is by grace that we are kind of brought in, but then to stay in, we need to be doing the sacraments and we participate in this life and penance and all of this to make sure that we are saved and to assure our salvation. And so for Luther, there's a sense of anxiety that takes over. He's not sure about his assurance. Like, how does he know if he's saved? It's kind of like, and this is something that Luther had, you know, he doesn't feel it. He doesn't feel what maybe he thinks he should be feeling when he thinks about God or when he prays or whatever. He would go and he would give confession, and then on the way back from confession, he would think some thought, and then he would run back to his confessor to say, "Hey, I sinned on the way back," and it frustrated even, I think, his confessor. And so there's this deep anxiety that he has about his salvation and this idea of participating in our justification and sanctification. Now, again, he goes to Rome and he sees kind of the corruption of the church, and he's eventually going to have this epiphany on the book of Romans. And so I just want to read here a little bit of this epiphany that he has, this breakthrough he has as he's reading Romans. Now, again, he is an Augustinian monk, so he is having the same epiphany that Augustine had. If we go back and think about the confessions and Augustine's conversion, he had the conversion while he's reading the book of Romans. So this is a quote here from Luther. He says, "Nevertheless, in spite of the ardor of my heart, I was hindered by the unique word in the first chapter of Romans. The righteousness of God is revealed in it. I hated the word righteousness of God, because in accordance with the usage and custom of the doctors, I'd been taught to understand it philosophically as meaning, as they put it, the formal or active righteousness according to which God is righteous and punishes sinners and the unjust. As a monk, I led an irreproachable life. Nevertheless, I felt that I was a sinner before God. My conscience was restless, and I could not depend on God being propitiated by my satisfactions. Not only did I not love, but I actually hated the righteous God who punishes sinners. Thus a furious battle raged within my perplexed conscience. But meanwhile I was knocking at the door of this particular Pauline passage, earnestly seeking to know the mind of the great apostle. Day and night I tried to meditate upon it. The significance of these words, the righteousness of God is revealed in it, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So he's having this struggle with, am I righteous enough? Am I good enough? And the righteousness of God for him meant this holy God who looks down on humanity and sees us in our sin, and we are nothing, and therefore the wrath of God comes upon us. But then he has this epiphany, and he continues on. Then finally God had mercy on me, and I began to understand that the righteousness of God is a gift of God by which a righteous man lives, namely faith. In that sentence, the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, is passive, indicating that the merciful God justifies us by faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Now I felt as though I had been reborn altogether and had entered paradise. In that same moment, the face of the whole scripture became apparent to me. My mind ran through the scriptures as far as I was able to recollect them, seeking analogies and other phrases, such as the work of God, by which he makes us strong, the wisdom of God, by which he makes us wise, the strength of God, the salvation of God, the glory of God. Just as intensely as I had now hated the expression, the righteousness of God, I now lovingly praise this most pleasant word. The passage from Paul became to me the very gate to paradise. So what's going to happen is Luther is going to have this epiphany of perspective about what that righteousness means and what justification by faith actually means. Now, just to fill out a little bit of the timeline and the history here, so that we can then in the next lecture kind of move on to dig into, what Luther's epiphany is. So what begins to happen is Luther gets into a conflict. So he has this awakening through the book of Romans. And then he hears about this Johann Tetzel who's going around trying to raise money through indulgences for the building of St. Peter's Basilica. And he's troubled. So Tetzel is like this snake oil salesman. He's a showman, and he's going around and he's selling indulgences to try to raise as much money as possible. Now, again, Luther is not opposed to indulgences at this point, but what he sees is an abuse of indulgences. And so he posts his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door, the church door. Now, what does he want to do? He's a professor. He wants to debate. And this is what you would do. You would kind of post it on the door. It'd be like posting on Twitter or TikTok or whatever to kind of say, hey, let's debate this issue. So the public could see it. And so he wants to debate these things, not necessarily start a revolution or a reformation. Eventually, though, this works its way up the church hierarchy, and they catch wind of it. And they want to silence Luther and silence his priests. Now, there's a fascinating conversation to be had about the personalities involved here. The Pope at the time, Luther's personality. What if there had been cooler heads or different personalities involved? I mean, it's a great what if question. But all of this contributes to this ratcheting up of this question and this debate. And finally, Luther has debate with Eck, where he comes out and basically says, look, I'm a Hussite. If this is what Huss believed, this is where I stand. I can only stand on the word of God. I can do no other. And so he begins to question the papacy. He questions the authority of the church. He's questioning the traditions. All of these things are coming into question. And as a result of all of this, Luther is finally excommunicated and is sentenced to death. But before they can kill him, the German princes step in and they whisk him away and they hide him in a castle at Wittenberg. Again, there's all these cultural, political, theological issues all coming together. The German princes wanting to get out from underneath the Pope. But Luther really has this experience. He has this moment. And therefore, it's important for us to recognize the shift that is taking place with the Reformation, with what Luther is doing. Now, again, what does Luther want to do? He wants to reform the church. Like Erasmus, he wants to reform the church, but eventually he gets kicked out of the church. And so the Reformation then begins to happen. So just to summarize, it's important for us to recognize all the things that are coming together here to cause this Reformation. There's philosophical issues, there's cultural issues, there's personality issues, but there is also very important biblical and theological issues at work here. And it's important for us, I think, to recognize the difference between what Luther is saying and what the Western Roman Catholic Church and this Thomist perspective is saying. Even to this day, I would suggest Catholics and Protestants do have some differences. And I think to diminish those differences isn't helpful for us. I do think we need to see each other as brothers and sisters in Jesus, and have conversation with each other, but also we need to recognize some of the real differences that exist in our perspective. So in the next few lectures, what we want to do is explore, what did Martin Luther believe? What did he believe about justification by faith? What did he believe about the sacraments? What did he believe about the two kingdoms? And then from there, we're going to move into some of the other reformers, John Calvin, the Anabaptists, and begin kind of pushing towards a reformational understanding, but then also kind of modern and contemporary theological perspectives.